I can't paint. If you've ever said these words, then you're not alone. Lacking confidence when painting can really hamper your progress, but I promise you that painting is a skill that can be learned. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to paint this succulent using my Learn to Paint as you paint approach, helping you gain confidence, break down those barriers so that you can create a painting you are happy with. Roll intro. Hi and welcome to my studio. As you can see, I've done a really simple outline of the succulent by just printing out a photograph of it and putting some pencil on the back and tracing it down this way. You want a really simple outline. We have a free line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial, and I'll tell you later on how you can obtain access to these. So let's just talk about materials really quickly before we start painting. The paints I'm using are from Gallo. The colours I've chosen are Harbour blue, sap, copper blue, opera and Notturno. And if you don't have these colours, don't worry, I'll explain to you as we work through the tutorial different colours that you can use. And the brushes I've chosen to work with today are from Zen Art supplies from their fine line range, as well as my old spotter to mix the colours. So the brushes will come in a little set like this, and they are super inexpensive, and I will link everything I'm using in the description box underneath this video. The paper is mixed media, and I'll explain a little later on the brand that I'm using and why. These are the colours that I've swatched out from my pan set here, and I'll put an information card on the top of your screen so that you can mix your own colour chart, and I also show you within that video how you can match your colours to your photo. So watercolour painting is all about working from light to dark, and we apply our colours in gentle layers as we go through. If you're new to painting, I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see that tricky process unfold. I'm mixing a really watery mix of Harbour blue with a tiny bit of sap green, and the other colour I mixed was copper blue with a tiny bit of Harbour blue. Harbour blue is a rather unique colour, and if you don't have it, you could use something like indigo with cerulean green. If you don't have any of the colours that I'm using and you're struggling to match your colours yourself, then please drop a comment in the box underneath this video and I'll see if I can help you match the colours to the colours that you have within your own kit. Some of the petals are more of, I don't know whether you call them petals, some of the segments are more green in tone and some of them are more blue. So focusing first of all on the outside edges, which have a definite more green colour, applying the paint directly onto the paper. This means working wet in dry. Now you can see me here just putting water to the pencil line, and this is wet in wet. That simply means you're applying the water to the areas where you want to drop in the paint, and you can see me here dropping in that blue tone, making sure that I stay within the pencil line. So it's really important that you apply your water where you want the paint to go. Now, if you're new to my channel and you're wondering why I've got a little puddle of water on my palette and I'm dipping my brush in, I like to paint this way because I feel that when I'm dipping my brush into my water jar, I overload the brush and it can be really tricky to control your paint. So that's a little bit of a pro tip that I like to share with my viewers because it can really help your paint application. It's a simple thing, but by putting your brush into the jar, you can overload your brush with water. I'm just using the tip of my brush here to soften any hard edges when the paint dries. I've continued the process on all of the other segments of the succulent apart from the middle, and this is a flat synthetic brush from the range that I've spoke about earlier from Zen Art supplies, and I'm just using this just really damp to create a wiggle in motion to soften any hard edges that have dried. When watercolour dries, it just leaves a sort of hard edge, and I'm not keen on that. So this is the Rowney mixed media paper that I've used for today's tutorial, and this is the brand that I always use when I'm talking about mixed media. It's the only one I've ever been really successful with, and I absolutely love it. So looking at the pink tones that you can see within the succulent, for this I'm mixing a really watery mix of opera. Now, because the colours I'm using today are from Gallo, I would say that opera in this particular set is very similar to a quinacridone magenta, but please use whatever pinky tone that you have. What you will probably notice here is the tiny amount of pigment that I'm using. Because the succulent has really gentle switches in colour and tone, I'm really applying light washes to begin with. This is what I call my template wash, and it just means it's guiding me as I work through the painting bit by bit, showing myself which bits of colour go where, so that when I come to add the darker layers later on, I know exactly where I'm going. So just applying wet and wet here and dropping in that tiny pink tone, as you can see. Now, at the beginning of this video, you may have seen a message on the screen saying that we have a free trace down line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial, indeed all of our tutorials here on YouTube, and you can access them by joining our Facebook group, which I will link in the description box underneath this video. So do consider joining us. We are an amazing bunch of people, fast growing community over there, and you can also share your finished paintings from our tutorials and get some feedback, both from me and our wonderful group members. Everyone is super friendly, and I'm just really proud to be part of this group. So do consider joining us so that you can join in with these tutorials. So now I'm working wet and dry because the areas are really small here. Notice how I'm constantly patting my brush on the kitchen paper. This means I'm not overloading my brush with pigment or water. I'm just applying a tiny bit of the ochre colour to the outside edge of this petal here, making sure that everything's dry before I do this. It's really important that all your layers are dry before you apply the next, otherwise each layer of paint will bleed into the wet paper. So you want it to be really dry before you do it. Because it's watercolour, it really doesn't take very long anyway. So this is a number 1 size brush that I'm using here, but use any brush that you feel comfortable with that has a fairly small point. These brushes do make light work of the tutorial, as well as the spotter brushes that I normally use. So you can see how I'm just applying the paint here and just putting the brush into the water on my palette and just using a kind of wiggling motion to soften that into the existing layer of paint. When I was recording this video and I was editing the first edit, it does look really sort of funny when I'm doing it, sort of picking up the paint, dipping my brush into the water and repeating the process, but it does make sense to have this tiny puddle of water on my palette and then patting my brush on the kitchen paper to take off the excess pigment and water at the same time. So just working through petal by petal or segment by segment, applying this pink wash to the outside of each petal as I see fit, patting it dry and then just wiggling it through like this. So if you don't have ochre, you could use quinacridone magenta or something like that, but any pink tone will do. So everything's dry and you can see me here mixing a tiny puddle of Notturno along with Harbour blue. Now Notturno is a rather unusual colour from a Gallo. If you have Daniel Smith's Moonglow, that would work. It's a granulating colour, and to be perfectly honest with you, it doesn't do it justice using it this way. So you could also use something like a really dark purple with maybe a little bit of Payne's grey, but you just want that kind of greyish purpley tone here. And you can see me working wet and wet at a tiny area at a time and just dropping in that colour with the tip of my very small brush here. Now remember, at the beginning of this video I did say that painting is a skill that can be learned, and this is so true. It really is all about practice. You can see me here just repeating the process on the other petals, on the other segments rather, noticing how I'm leaving a little bit of gap where the first wash was applied, so that we are now building up our layers. So tonal value is as important as the correct colour. So we're looking at our mid-tones, our light tones and our darker tones. So we have our light tones in place already when we did our first wash, and we are now applying our mid-tones by getting this other colour in. And you notice how I'm still using that same application process by applying the paint, patting my brush dry and wiggling it through. And I'll be doing this throughout the tutorial. I won't keep saying it though. So just applying the green, I'm just dipping between the green tone and the blue tone, as you can see there on my palette. So the green tone that I have is sap and Harbour blue, and like I said, if you don't have Harbour blue, you could use sap green with maybe a little bit of Cerulean green, something like that. I ought to mention actually that I've gained a lot of new subscribers recently, so thank you so much for your support. Feel free to introduce yourself in the comments below to say hi. It's lovely to have you here as part of my growing tribe, so thank you so much for your support. It really does mean a lot to me. When I'm applying the paint to each segment, notice how I'm leaving a little gap at the top of each spiky part. I don't know what you call them. I don't want to take the paint right to the end or the outside edge of many of these segments. You'll notice that there's a little gap, and it's really important that that is kept. So I'm just repeating the process with the darker values on this outside segment here, using the tip of this very fine brush to control my paint. And you can see the tiniest amount of paint is being applied and cleaning my brush and then blending it through. So you can really work on a small section at a time here with this painting. So it's not overwhelming at all. You can really take your time with it. And enjoy the process. Remember, painting is all about enjoyment as well. We are learning a new skill, but it's also about having fun. So it's the same process throughout, applying that paint, patting my brush and wiggling it through like this, and I'm going to continue this process on the other petals that are on the outside of this succulent. So we are using the reference photograph just as a kind of guide. We're not being absolutely photo accurate with this one. It's just to sort of get you started in painting. Notice how I'm leaving a little gap towards the outside edge here, so that when I paint the adjoining petal like this, we can see that it's a separate part. It's really, really important that we leave those outside edges clear of paint. And it's also important that you make sure that every segment is dry, which is why I'm kind of skipping between segments. I wouldn't apply the paint to the section next to that because it would just bleed into that existing, so they would just bleed together otherwise. So I'm jumping around for that reason, making sure that I apply paint to the watercolour that is already dry. Because I'm using mixed media paper for this painting tutorial, it does mean that the blending is very, very easy. If I were to be using a high quality watercolour paper, the blending can be a little bit more tricky in my experience, but this mixed media paper really does make light work of the blending. Now, I did mention this Daler Rowney mixed media paper. I have tried another brand and I really didn't like it. I'm not sure whether this would apply to different brands, but the Daler Rowney one I highly recommend. Okay, so everything's dry and I've cleaned down my palette and I've mixed Notturno. I've mixed Harbour blue, and we've got the copper blue being mixed here. And I'm adding a tiny bit of opera to that. and Opera on its own, and my number 2.0 brush, which has a really fine point. I'm applying the copper blue here. You could actually use just plain water, but I love this color. I haven't used it for such a long time. So you could just use water instead of copper blue, and you can see that once it's sort of settled into the paper, I'm just dropping in the Harbour blue around the outside, once again leaving that outside edge clear where we painted in that Opera colour. So I'm painting it in and just dropping in tiny little bits of the Harbour blue like this. So we're kind of working wet in wet. So once again, copper blue, and I'm just dropping in this pink tone, and because the paint is slightly wet, you can see it bleeding into that copper blue tone as I would expect to happen. It's not the end of the world. It wasn't really meant to happen, but I actually quite like it. And I'm just dropping in a tiny bit of Harbour blue here, just down the sort of left-hand side, and just leaving a tiny gap in the middle. Cleaning my brush again and just doing my usual blending process. So you can see that by working wet and wet, how these colours gently merge, to gently sort of blur into each other. It's actually quite a nice effect. I use both wet in wet and wet in dry painting when I'm painting for myself and when I'm also doing these tutorials, just so that you can see. When I've applied the paint, you'll see me here just using my brush to gently move that paint around. Because we're working wet and wet, you have the ability for a good few minutes to sort of wiggle that paint into the areas that you want to. Because there's a layer of water or pigment on there, you can have that sort of chance to move it around as I'm doing here. So you have complete control of your paint. I think one of the things that worries people about watercolour is that you don't have control of it, but believe me, you really can if you work on small sections at a time, and just like I said, it's all about practice. So once again, same process, Harbour blue to begin with, avoiding the outside edge, and just dropping, copper blue to begin with, avoiding that outside edge, and dropping in the Harbour blue like this by just dotting into that paper. Wet in wet, avoiding that outside edge. So because I only applied the copper blue to the areas where I want to drop in the Harbour blue, you can see there's a tiny little gap on the outside as before. So I've repeated the process on the other petals and everything's dry now, and I'm using my flat synthetic brush here. Now this is completely dry and you don't have to do this, but once again I'm going through each segment of the plant and I'm just using a really soft motion, a really light application to just get rid of any of those hard edges. As I said at the beginning, I don't really like them. Some people don't mind that kind of look, but this is something I like to do, and I'm just going to go through the plant like this by wiggling that brush very, very softly over the dry paper with the dry brush. You can also do the same thing by using a plain water glaze, and I'll show you later on what I mean. You can just use a soft brush with a tiny bit of water to go over it and let the whole thing dry. But for now, I'm just using that flat synthetic brush to do that. And we're just going to repeat the process on the other petals. So you can see already this has got a kind of three-dimensional look. We've got our different tones and we've got our different values. So once again, just working through segment by segment and taking my time and dropping in that beautiful Harbour blue. And I'm going to let that blur gently, emerge gently into the colour I've applied just now. Just no stress, stress-free painting. Picking up that Harbour blue and dropping it in. Purposely leaving a gap in the middle here, and everything's completely dry and I've finished the process on all of the other segments. I'm using a number 2 size round here to blend the colours. As I mentioned earlier on, you can either use the flat dry brush or you can just use a really light wash of water over the entire thing. You really don't have to do this. I know it can be a little bit daunting if you're worried about sort of too heavy a hand or blending your colours together, but it's just something I like to do once everything's dry, and it just gives it a really soft edge. And it's really important that you let everything dry completely before you begin to paint again. But this is just something I do kind of midway through painting. If you're using a heavier grade paper like a cold press paper, then it works much better. But for something as light as a mixed media paper, you really don't have to do it. It's just what I like to do. But once everything's dry, we can go on to our darker tones here. You can see me mixing up the same colours as before, this time with a little less water so that the paint has more pigment. Harbour blue and Notturno here, so you could use the suggestions that I've given earlier, and I'm using my number 5.0 brush to start to add a little bit more finer detail. I'm going to be using exactly the same method of application as I did before, and just blending those colours in, looking at my darker tones and working between each segment. This is also a really good opportunity to tidy up any hard edges and to enhance some of the adjoining petals with that paint. You can see how I'm using the brush in a particular way, almost by dabbing it around each segment to create that sharp edge, rather than just trying to draw a fine line. I'm just using a pat-in motion to pull my paint where I want it to go. So I'm just going to run through the colours again. The colours I've chosen for this tutorial are Harbour Blue, Sap, Copper Blue, Opera and Notturno. These are all from a Gallo. Alternatives would be for Harbour Blue, Indigo and Cerulean Green. Sap most people have. Copper Blue, I would go for something like a pale green and a French ultramarine, although they won't be this copper blue colour. It's rather unique, but it will be something that you can use for this tutorial. Opera, Quinacridone Magenta and Notturno is rather unique. If you have any Daniel Smiths, you could use Piemontite Genuine or Moonglow, or something like a Mineral Violet with perhaps Payne's Grey or something like that. So as you can see, I'm just enhancing the outside of these segments now and blending the paint into the existing wash. So we're kind of just enhancing everything that we've done. As I said earlier on, because that template is in place, we can just follow what we've put in place and just get those stronger colours and tonal variations in place as well. As you can see, the paint on my palette is a lot drier now, and it's much easier to handle these smaller areas. So as you can see, once again, I'm just using this opportunity to sharpen up any edges and take that darker tone like this. This is the Harbour blue mix. We have Harbour blue with a tiny bit of sap here, just adding my darker tones to this element of the plant. Just applying the paint a tiny section at a time. As I said, it's all about control and applying tiny bits of paint where you can really enhance your painting. I haven't really done very much to the middle at the moment, so we'll work on that in a little while, but I'm just using that brush to sharpen up any edges like this. I've mixed a tiny bit of ochre here now, and I'm applying this to the middle. And I'm using the, this is the Notturno with the Harbour blue. Once again, avoiding that edge there, just leaving that little gap. And of course, this is wet on dry because the areas are very tiny and we don't want our colours to blur together. So still building up these layers, and because we've got really watery washes, we're able to apply quite a few layers of paint, leaving the gap and blending them through. If you are finding value in this video, please give it a thumbs up. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you like me, and your support means everything. Also, you may want to consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that bell notification so that you don't miss new content every single Tuesday. You can join us if you're on Instagram. We are at The Wonders of Watercolour. You may want to consider following us over there, where we post up behind the scenes things, glimpses of upcoming tutorials. And if that's not enough, we also have a Patreon. So if botanical painting is your thing, we have a Patreon site where we have full-length painting tutorials from £7 plus VAT every single month. They are exclusive to Patreon and are not on YouTube, and they are of course ad-free. And you'll also have access to our weekly kind of vlog doodle type videos as well. So I will link it in the description box underneath this video if you'd like to join us there, and it's also a way that you can support my channel. So back to the job in hand. I'm continuing to paint with this colour that I've mixed on my palette here, that is now a little bit drier and therefore easier to handle on these smaller areas. As I say, it's just a case of repeating the process now, so I'm going to stop talking and let you listen to some music to the end of this video. I'll also put up a playlist of other botanical painting tutorials that you can have a look at. These are free on YouTube, so do consider clicking through, and I'll see you there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.